when there was a growing counter-norm that women should not accept these forms of chivalrous acts because they were so tied with an expectation that they ought reciprocate, because they were so tied with other existing gender norms which were coercive, because they shielded men who were typically misogynist while also holding these chivalrous acts and conforming to these norms. We tell you in this debate that the feminist movement ought jump on and support the women who existingly felt awful supporting this norm. This was something they needed to do to retain their base. 4 things I'm going to look at in this speech. Before I do that, under setup. 4 things the feminist movement probably cared about. First, and most substantial was probably just that it gave the greatest amount of autonomy to all women in general. That is, that it should give them the option and it should not pressure them to feel things that are harmful. Secondly, I think it just has a historical obligation to challenge existing patriarchal norms, even in the cases where those norms are not harmful or bad in of themselves. It's important to challenge them even in the first place. Thirdly, I think it was to support its existing members that are, because those were the members that have spent the most time, the money and resources on the movement. Secondly, because they had the greatest dedication for the changes and actually got policy change for feminists. Finally, just because they had the obligation to repay them for the past successes and past contributions that they've done for the feminist movement. Finally, I think they just want to increase general participation and allow women to come on board of their movement. Why did we achieve these things under our case? For again, first thing is what this message actually looked like, why it was going to be done well. First thing to note is that it was likely to present this message in 3 ways that were positive. First is it would set up a counter-norm and piggyback off the existing growing counter-norm movement that looked like to say it was okay to refuse these sorts of things, but also just to challenge the historical nature of this norm, that it was deeply patriarchal, that it was deeply ingrained within society. The second thing was to know it would frame it in a way to empower women. That is because it has always done that. It has always been to maximize women's choices, but it was likely to look like things such as encouragement, which the topic literally dictates, but far more importantly, it looks like sets of role models and social media figures, articles in the New York Times, and things like Instagram posts to explain how liberating it feels to challenge this norm, to explore the problematic nature of this norm. Secondly, I think it included a realm of a polite rejection. Things like there was a gradient of acceptability of refusals that meant it was okay if you sensed that there was a misogynist who was using this norm to shield themselves. It was okay to be angry at that and to harshly reject that norm. It was also okay to politely reject that norm and say, actually, why don't I buy you a drink instead? Thirdly, I think it was likely to be done well for 4 broad reasons. First is the feminist movement is largely tolerant because it is enormous, has to cater to an enormous diversity of groups, cares deeply about all of those groups, and tries to cater well to all of them. Secondly, because it is intersectional in many forms, that is, that feminism has multiple, like a broad horizontal structure, and that means that even if certain areas of feminist movement are less intersectional, there are others that are a lot more, and they discuss. Third thing is that it is an issue that all women face, regardless of privilege, and it's a common everyday issue they could all resonate with. But fourthly, just because it does it all the time, it has challenged historical norms for its entire history, and in particular, look at the forms of norms such as challenging gender pay gaps, forms of maternity or childcare leaves. It does this well. Secondly, it gives a sense of independence to these women, and giving them the option was the most important thing in this debate. Reasons are twofold. First, currently, it is seemed as non-okay to reject these forms of norm. That is, even though it is a growing movement, the fact that the feminist movement has not endorsed that and it has not actively encouraged that means that it is limited still to the most extreme or the most feminist, and that was harmful. Reasons are threefold. First, because there was a deep historical norm to accept those things, because it had the aura of being chivalrous and the aura of being honorable. Secondly, because these narratives were deeply perpetuated by men, that is the way that they show their affection to women, and that was awful. Thirdly, it's because it was women in particular here were adverse to forms of alienation, of that it did seem like something that only more extreme feminists could participate in, and not something that the general movement on the whole could. Secondly, why did this actually give a counter norm that was meaningful? 3 reasons. First, because you increase the numbers substantially of people who feel comfortable with that norm and participate in it actively. Note that this is a cycle. The more people that join, the more comfortable that they feel joining it. Secondly, because the fact that it was growing meant that at some point in time, the feminist movement probably wanted to do it anyway, to the extent that otherwise eventually it would be seriously alienating large parts of its base, meant that we should just do this early to give individuals a sense of choice, and we should make sure that this counter norm feels like safe within society. That was important in the first place. Secondly, why did we just empower women? 2 things to look at here. First is underneath individuals. Note immediately, there was a sense of independence that you felt when you were challenging a norm that felt great, that you did not feel pressured in of yourself. That was something that we ought to encourage all women to feel. But secondly, just note that I think you can still support if a man has noble intentions whilst doing chivalrous acts. You can still be particularly polite of those acts and you know, frame it in a positive way. You do not need to endorse, however, the act of chivalry in of itself, because that is the part which was harmful. Secondly, I just think the movement on the whole improves drastically. Reasons are threefold. First, because you take away the defense of chivalry that particularly misogynistic men used to say, look, this is why we're okay, this is why we treat women well. Secondly, because this norm entrenches other norms, that is, that norms are typically uprooted together, it is very difficult to say, no, this norm is okay, but no, this norm isn't. But far more importantly, because the norms are used to defend each other, you're just like, if you hold this norm, then surely you ought to hold this norm as well. It's important that we just got them blanket all up in the first place. Thirdly, I just think it generates a huge amount of discourse, right? It seems bold, it seems subversive, and that was important because you were likely to start the momentum for a new wave, particularly to the extent that all women could resonate with this. It was an everyday occurrence. Finally, why do we just hold men to higher account? Why do they improve? And why do they treat women better on our side? Reasons are fivefold. First, because chivalry is commonly interlaced with misogyny. Reasons are threefold. First, this is a deep historical relic. Some of the most old-fashioned and conservative men are the most chivalrous. Second, because sexist media is the ones that perpetuate it the most, that looks like incredibly sexist films that show men as having to be chivalrous and show men as having to treat women in that way. Thirdly, because it is common anti-feminist rhetoric for men to jump up and say, look at the good things that we do, how can you criticize us for doing these sorts of things, meant that the types of men who were particularly misogynistic were also particularly chivalrous. That was harmful. Because you simply could not now attack and criticize those men to the same extent, that was a massive benefit on our side. We could separate those individuals. Second, because the men's movements in particular lost an important shield, that is, they could not defend themselves in the same way in the media, meant that discourse was particularly more favorable on the outside of the house. But far more importantly here, I think you can delineate sorts of men that are actually allies in this debate and actually care about women's movement. That was important. Thirdly, I just think you hold men to higher standards. That is, you say, it is not enough for you to act chivalrously, to hold open a door for women to be an ally of feminists and to care deeply for their rights. It is simply low bar. We tell you we ought push men to act better. Fourthly, chivalry in of itself was probably just anti-feminist in many ways. That is, that it paints them as particularly delicate, that they need certain forms of special treatment. But secondly, that it just reinforces inherent gender differences, right? Like just because you're a woman, you ought to be treated in this manner. That was probably something that was harmful. Finally, I just think you gave men more freedom. That is, they could feel more comfortable supporting women in different ways. If it is true that men had noble intentions in this debate, then it gave them so much more flexibility to not feel pressured to have to support women in this way, to act chivalrously. That was good because they could clearly prove to individuals that they were allies, could feel more comfortable supporting the movement in other ways, and also you could criticize the people that weren't better. All those reasons are proud to propose.
By the end of first staff's speech, I was left thinking that this is a men's problem. It is a men's problem that they act in this way, and to expect women to have to be the actors, to imperil their safety, and to undermine the change going on within the feminist movement was like a terrible flaw in the opposition's case, and ultimately was the reason why they were going to lose by their very own metrics. So a few points in setup. Firstly, the alternative that we would encourage here is women to have a neutral stance. They have just no principal obligation either way to accept or decline chivalrous behavior. Secondly, we thought the aims of the feminist movement were A, to protect women, and B, to change social norms. But ultimately, the protection of women was more important in the sense that you have no rights if you are dead or you are unsafe. Thirdly, note that feminism's feminist movement necessarily has limited influence. They're unlikely to change the misogynistic society because they can only message to women in the movement. That is very important because the more people in the movement, the more change they make. This change pushes people out of the movement. Fourthly, to note that the opposition may say it is encouragement to women, but necessarily their world is quite different to the status quo, because if people do change their behaviors, they are doing things that they otherwise wouldn't have because of a perceived obligation or belief in feminist movement. We don't think this is going to happen, as I'll outline in my case. Finally, we think we're happy to say that women don't owe men anything from these actions. That is fine. So firstly, on this notion that this imposes an unjust burden onto women, we think that women should not be accountable to the actions of misogynistic men. Why? In the same way that we shouldn't victim blame, we shouldn't ask women to dress better to prevent rape. It is wrong to ask women to like not do a certain thing or to do a certain thing because we think that it is bad for them. This holds because women's rights of self-determination are ultimately controlled or like infringed upon by the actions of other people, especially when women have zero ability to control such extreme actions likely to be patronizing or misogynistic when like enacted by men. What is the impact here? We think that this is an imperative that outweighs any practical considerations that the opposition can bring to you, because ultimately the feminist movement ought to prioritize women's rights utmost, because they are the key actors for these rights, and it is their role, therefore, to make sure these rights are like most best protected. So how do we utilize this principle in today's debate? We show you that women are going to feel unsafe, and they are going to be unsafe under the ops case. Four main reasons. Firstly, the confrontation that this necessitates is inherently challenging. You are challenging someone's deepest beliefs and instincts, and like to expect that they will not retaliate in some way is like quite naive of the opposition. Secondly, to note that there's always an element of uncertainty about how these misogynistic men are going to react. Like what are they going to do? Will they simply like give you an evil look, or will they beat you up in the street later on? It's just unclear to know, and there's a huge spectrum of behavior that may emerge. Thirdly, we think that they do have a credible fear because men lash out at women all the time. It is conceivable that in response to like a rejection like this, they may also lash out in the same way. And finally, to note that like this is probably done in a public setting, but there are other men around who probably empower and enable like men to feel even more like encroached upon when they get rejected by women. Secondly, to note, a second principle here to note is like to ask women to do stuff that like ultimately endangers their safety is yet another violation of like their autonomy, which the opposition was so keen to defend. This stands because like personal safety in this realm ought not to be weaponized in favor of some arbitrary characteristic. Like, why should I be a battering ram for people who look like me? Why should I cop like potential hate and vitriol from a man by standing up to them just because like this is like good for like the feminine movement? Secondly, we note that like in the feminist movement, it's like a particular first priority is the immediate harms and dangers presented to women. It is not to like contribute to other harms that may occur or norms that like shape society, because like all other rights are ultimately contingent on the ability of women to like safely express their opinions and to safely like exist within society. The other thing to note here is like often chivalrous behavior, as the opposition said, is like coupled with other narratives that like women need to be protected because they're like the fairer sex. And this is closely aligned with like narratives about men, which make like their likely retaliation even more pernicious. As the opposition noted to you, like this by this very same mechanism that the most chivalrous men are also the most likely to be misogynistic, they're probably going to lash out because they feel that they have ownership over women because of these narratives that they've been told, like whereby they have to protect women. And so any challenge to this necessitates like quite a strong visceral reaction. A portion of the men likely to react negatively when women challenge them because they are going to view it as unacceptable, that women aren't in their place, and like that was a harm that the opposition could never overcome. The impacts are twofold. Note, crucially, that there will be a feeling of unsafety, which is a huge burden and harm in and of itself. I don't know if you know what it's like to walk through the streets holding a set of keys, fearing for your life. But if this is the overwhelming feeling that women are forced to deal with because the feminist movement voices change onto them, I would highly recommend the opposition takes a good look in the mirror and realizes that's a terrible, terrible idea. Secondly, there's a very real threat to women's safety because the uncertainty and the range of possible reactions means that women will ultimately be unlikely to be able to see who are the nice guys who might like understand their response to this change. So despite all precautions, the likelihood that something is going to go wrong and endanger women's safety is like incredibly large. And like any like arguments the opposition wants to say about freedom of choice, about women's liberation, and about their autonomy ultimately fall out of the debate when you realize that safety is like the utmost concern here. So secondly, on the notion of changing attitudes, opposition wants to say that this is going to fight historical norms. We tell you this doesn't happen because of three main reasons. Firstly, we observe that the feminist movement is already making great progress in the status quo. We have things like Me Too making social change. We have like legislative and political representation going on. And finally, we just have a general greater awareness of women's rights in the status quo. Secondly, to note that this movement relies crucially on allies and women joining in and believing in the movement in the first place. There are a couple of reasons why less women are going to join the movement under the ops case. Firstly, because of the very real harm they perceive to be like that their safety is going to be violated. And secondly, that the feminist movement is like overreaching their scope, and they're like trying to influence the everyday behavior of people. In that sense, like any social movement is probably a poor actor in terms of telling people what to do in and of their life in like a religious and like preachy way. Note that even if the feminist movement is able to frame their message like very well in the best way possible, this is ultimately going to be distorted by media and by word of mouth, because as the opposition so rightly pointed out, we live in a patriarchal society who probably are not going to tolerate the kind of like messages that the feminist movement wants to portray this as. So let's analyze how men's behavior is therefore going to be changed under the Ops case. We think that because these behaviors are A, very deep set, B, like a part of an inherent power dynamic that gets threatened when this change happens, and finally, because it challenges perceptions of like men's understanding of their identity in the world, we think that the likely response is that men are going to be like totally unresponsive at the point where there is a sudden change to their behavior. So we prefer a world where they realize this problematic behavior themselves. We don't think norms change under the opposition model because of these reasons, because like their patriarchal attitudes are so a part of their identity. Proud to negate. Thank you.
Just because you do not know how a man will react does not mean we don't support things like consent. That doesn't mean that even though you don't know how they will react, that you can still say no, and that is something that is still supported in society, right? Like, we don't stop women's ability to say no to things that men ask just because you are scared of how they will react. The fact that you should probably succumb because you are scared of how they will react is not something that has ever been like supported within society. 3 questions in this speech. Firstly, why do we improve the behavior of men under our side of the house? Secondly, why this gives more traction to the feminist movement itself? And thirdly, why this gives women more autonomy. Firstly, on this question of why this improves behavior of men, which is, I think, where the main crux of the opposition's case lies. The first big push they give you here is why are we talking about men? Like it should not be, like it should be on, like, why do women have to change how men behave? Like it should be on the men themselves. I think it's like a very idealistic approach to take to be like, oh, like it's not up to women to also like affect how men act, because I think the existing structures in society mean that something is always going to go the way it is unless you actually change something. And it is probably an unfortunate reality that you have to deal with the fact that you probably have to, like, even in an idealistic world, you should just have better and men should just act better. It is not pragmatic to say that that is going to happen. And I think it is within the feminist movement's duty, and it's something that they have done historically to try and engage men, even though that might be not something that is idealistic. I think the feminist movement at every single step prioritizes things like pragmatism over idealism, because that is how they are going to get proper political and social change. That is why they, as an actor, would necessarily try to do this and encourage women to stop these norms as well. Secondly, here, I think men have an undue power within this debate, within this like kind of norm, right? Because obviously things like they actually have historical power, but secondly, like any backlash you get from men is going to be incredibly massive, which is why this is necessarily something you have to deal with. The big push they give you here, which I think is the main part of their speech, is that men, this is going to harm the safety of women. And the main mechanism, the sole mechanism, in fact, that they give you is that men will feel rejected and therefore they will lash out. Like, 4 responses here, right? Firstly, I think this is something that, if that is true, that is something that currently occurs anyway, right? Like, at the point in which women feel like they feel pressured and they don't want to do something, now they don't have the ability to be like, no. Under this, when at the point in which you change these norms and you be like, it's okay to reject acts of chivalry, and you encourage more women to do that, then that means that it is more okay to say no as well. So women are like, that is something that is symmetric and probably worse under their side of the house. Secondly, as I mentioned in my introduction, even if you don't know how someone will react, it is still okay to say no. And that is just something that the feminist movement encourages at every stage as well, right? And like, that is going to be something that's important. But thirdly here, I think the specific way in which you reject acts of chivalry is something that is incredibly powerful here, right? Because it is something that that's much lower stakes than other things like sex that men might ask for, right? It often also holding doors open or buying drinks also often happens in more public places, right? Where you have people or like security cameras or like other people to also be there to support you and act as witnesses, right? That's why this was also something that was much better as well. Thirdly, under here, we think that oftentimes this confrontation doesn't have to be like the most intense, like F off, right? It often just could look like things like, no, let me buy you a drink, or like, no, thank you so much for holding the door open, but you go in through. I also think that also typically means it was often going to be more polite. So it's not going to be like so intense that men are going to feel like they're going to lash out. But fourthly, under their side of the house, right, in a world that doesn't like stop people from this norm, it just means behaviors of men continue, right? But men continue to expect things like women to like, you know, be like to buy drinks for women and stuff like that. Now, at this point, you change it, it is okay to reject them. But finally, the fifth thing to note here is that because of the way in which norms work, we also stand for things like long-term change, right? Things like over time, the number of men who expect like things in return from women reduce, the number of women who feel empowered to reject these norms also increase. That means you also get way better safety over the long term, but also we don't think there is any trade-off in safety in terms of the short term as well. And obviously obviously that's something we stand for. The second thing they bring you here is that this means like they'd be happy to stand by like narratives that say like women don't owe men anything even if they have acts of chivalry. I think that is the current narrative that prevails, and they don't have any type of counter mechanism to like refute that, right? At the point in which you say that like it's okay to reject acts of chivalry, then there is a less expectation of anything in return. That's why this improves the behavior of men. We also thought it was under here that was completely unresponded to was all the reasons why this also makes men better allies, right? Because it encourages higher standards of behavior, that just buying a woman a drink isn't enough to like get her attention. But secondly, for men who are particularly going to lash out, which is the main kind of stakeholder that they wanted to talk about, this also means that you reduce the ability for them to co-opt feminist messages that are like, oh, feminists want equal rights, but they still expect us to buy them drinks, right? Because now the feminist movement directly doesn't stand for that and actually like encourages women to go against that. That means the people who are the most harmful or who are going to be the most like kind of lashed out people, we're going to be way better under our side of the house. Please respond. Secondly, why this gives more traction to the feminist movement itself. The main push they give you here at First Neg is that women are scared, will like feel scared and don't want to join the movement because they are feeling like they are preached at, right? Firstly, I think insofar as this is what the feminist movement does all the time, right? Because they have the ability to do things like change norms. When feminists were like, let's get equal rights, or when feminists decided wanted to go have voting rights, this wasn't something that turned women away. Instead, they felt empowered, right? Because they were like, our thought, like what we want is being legitimized and our thoughts are being heard. We also thought things like when you scroll through your Instagram and you see like those really empowering like quotes on of feminists being like, no, reject like social norms and like reject acts of charity. That was really, really empowering, and you felt like a boss, right? And that was something that meant that people were necessarily going to have more traction on. But secondly, they tell you here is that media is going to co-opt narratives. Obviously, I think the media tends to often be on the side of justice. They tend to be, media generally errs on this, like the biggest forms of media, like the New York Times, or like things that break Me Too movements, obviously err on the side of like being much more progressive. That's why they were going to co-opt the message. Thirdly, then, on why this gives women more autonomy. I think there are two kind of categories of women. Firstly, women who are part of the movement currently, and secondly, women who aren't. Firstly, for women who are part of feminist movements more currently, they feel like they have an ability to say no to acts of charity because there is an inherent desire to actually want acts of charity or to yearn for it because you feel validated, because that's the main narrative that tells you it's okay. That at the point in which this changes, that feminist movements tell you to reject it, you feel okay in rejecting it, and you're more likely to reject it because you see it's also good for other women. But secondly, for women who maybe aren't or who don't think like acts of charity are bad, or who aren't as part of feminist movements, they were the ones who probably grew up with like their most conservative backgrounds, or the ones who didn't have access to things like the kind of feminist movements that you see. I think this challenges the way in which they think, right? Because they're now like, why is there this massive movement that's like we should reject acts of chivalry? You create more discourse through that. They also feel and that begins to incrementally change the types of behavior because they see other women rejecting acts of chivalry. They see they begin to question why that is the case, you now get those women on board into the feminist movement as well, or at least engaged within it as well. That's why you also necessarily increase the traction that the feminist movement has itself, and you also get male allies within the feminist movement too. So proud to propose.
The opposition's case has never really made sense so far, because they never seem to have a clear idea of what they were even trying to tell women to do. Because on one hand, they're trying to say, oh, like, we're encouraging that women can do whatever they want to do, and we just want to like empower women to like take charge of their own actions. But then on the other side, they're saying, no, women, like, you should do this really specific action of like actively rejecting like chivalry. And so we thought that there was always this contention running through their case of like telling women like an exact action they need to perform versus trying to say they're empowering women to just be themselves. We thought much more realistically on our side, the opposition was coercing women and burdening women with the unjust task of trying to fix men's behavior and fix the oppression that has been like put onto them by society, and like abandoning the whole narrative that the feminist movement was meant to stand behind, that like women should be able to be themselves like freely within society. Two issues in tonight's debate. Firstly, about like how does this message present itself? And secondly, about what will the effect of this message be? On to the first issue about how this message affects itself. The opposition tried to come out at first and tell you that like this message looked like they're saying, hey women, like it's okay to like refuse chivalry, like you can do it. Basically, they tried to say like women currently actually really want to refuse chivalry, but like they didn't because they didn't feel empowered to, and we're now suddenly going to empower them to so they can be like free to do it. However, we thought that this was just like a really unrealistic characterization of what the world looked like at all. We think that like firstly, women currently accept chivalry, like not because they feel you know, that they're not empowered to reject it, but really because like it's just like too hard and not worth it. Like I've never bothered to like reject a drink from a man just because like the time it would spend in my like fun night out clubbing to explain to the man, hey, like this is a really sexist behavior that like goes down for centuries, about like the idea that women need, like men need to own women. It's just not worth like missing my favorite song that's coming on at the club. Secondly, we thought that it's just like really like scary and intimidating for like women to have to like do this for men. The type of men that usually buy like women drinks at open doors, like you don't know how they're going to react. You're like literally subjecting yourself to danger. And even if that is just a perceived danger that doesn't actually exist, the like emotional trauma that like you're put through of having to face that man like one-on-one is like so like confronting. So but let's pretend we exist under their world. We're like, sure, like some women maybe like want to reject these notions of chivalry, some don't. The opposition just like has this idea that they are like just encouraging women you know, who want to reject chivalry, and like those that don't can kind of just live in their own world. But we actually think that the message that the opposition is sending is extremely coercive, because what the message they're sending is like, you can reject chivalry like to stop misogyny if you want, which is like very analogous to saying like, oh, like if you want to dress less provocatively to prevent rape, like I guess you can. This message like basically looks like telling women, you know, like if you like don't want to you know, if you want to support chivalry, you can, but like you're a really shit feminist who like supports misogyny and therefore like it's responsible for your own victimization. So like do it if you want. We think that this message is like absolutely so unfair, because you're basically telling women that like who have been oppressed by society, who have been like restricted their behavior for centuries, that it is on them like the reason why they're experiencing this like oppression, this victimization, and this like restriction of behavior and fear is because that they don't have like the guts or something to stand up to men. It's not like on women, and it shouldn't be on women to have to you know, be coerced into like being feminist by standing up to men and subjecting themselves. The only real response to this kind of awful unjust message that the feminist movement is having is on at second, when they said, okay, like the message might be shit, but like it might, like we don't live in an ideal world, and you might need to send women this like shit message in order to receive change. Note that at this point they basically like conceded, or like we're sending women this really like bad message, and we might be like burdening them really unfairly to like fix men, but like I guess that's okay if they can fix men. So which leads us to like the second issue of tonight's of the debate about like what the effect of this will be, because like we basically believe that they are like absolutely not at all going to change men's behavior, and instead you're just going to like leave women feeling really shit about themselves. So first, like, will this change men's behavior? You kind of had this like wishy-washy analysis at their first speaker telling you like, or like you might create some discourse among men, and like they're going to lose their justification for chivalry, so like, you know, misogyny will end. We thought that this was just like not how it looked like when a woman now says to a man like, hey, like, no, I don't want to drink, thanks, if they don't interpret it like, wow, this is the way that I viewed women as objects the way that I thought that like I was the owner of a woman is all wrong. I'm so sorry. They view this as being like, oh shit, that girl didn't like me very much and didn't want to drink. That's shot. Let me have my shot with like this other chick. Like it doesn't at all interpret at all the way like they thought it would. But more importantly, we gave you like clear mechanisms at first why we thought that men were unlikely to change their behavior. And this was because firstly, the type of misogynistic mind frame that men have is very deep set. Like it's linked to their identity. It's something that they are like raised with since birth. Like literally a 2-second interaction with a woman does not change this like kind of deep set mind frame. But secondly, we thought that like they just don't like understand, or they never understand like why women reacted that way. And we thought that the fact that they never understood the mechanisms behind that behavior meant they were actually never able to like link it with like wider ideas of misogyny or wider kind of behavior. So like we actually thought that like under our side, you were going to get like the type of change that was like much better for the feminist movement's kind of goals. Like what did we look like under our side? We thought that like the feminist movement currently in society was making massive headway. Like we've already seen, you know, so much like the gender pay gaps decreasing, like more women are in power, we're getting much more social discussion, more men joining the feminist movement. We thought this change was like better because it meant that people's like basis of understanding was happening. So you're getting like long-term change. This was like change to things like catcalling, change to things like not hiring women in like positions of leadership, not like changes to whether a man like opens a door or not. So we thought that like the kind of change you received from the outside was like much better. But like secondly, like the other effect they said was like they were empowering women, which I already kind of flagged in my intro, just didn't really make sense because you were never like empowering women to be able to like take autonomy of themselves and do whatever the hell they wanted, when you were telling them actually no, you have to like behave in this really certain like specific way. But also we thought that like the effect that it also had on women was like very like beneficial to only a small group of women. What do I mean by this? I think that the women that like at all have the capacity to like benefit from this message, that is like the women that maybe like want to like you know, reject notions of chivalry or have the capacity to, it aligns with like certain axes of privilege. That is like the people that like necessarily are in a spot to reject chivalry, like the like rich privileged white women who, you know, wants to go tell a man to fuck off. But we think that like the real like women that are suffering, the women that are truly oppressed, that are like have to put up so much, already feel unsafe in their neighborhoods, this is just like literally another burden that you are imposing on them. And we think that this is like more of the majority of women who already like live their lives feeling scared, feeling unsafe, feeling like they're kind of already adapting their behavior to kind of avoid confrontation with men. And then you're putting like literally another burden on them. We thought that like at best the opposition was like empowering like the rich white woman to like go up in a club and like have their moment. But like more realistically, they were like excluding a whole majority of women who the feminist movement really needed to protect from the feminist movement, because they were no longer able to like live up to these like idealistic like behaviors that the feminist movement wanted to impose on them. So like what we thought that like the end of the day this looked like was like you were not actually changing men's behavior at all, but you were like not only burdening women with an unjust message, but literally like rejecting women from the feminist movement who couldn't obey this like unrealistic message. You were only like making the feminist movement for a small minority of women, which was like completely against the aim of the feminist movement at all. Thank you very much. Proud to negate.
I think the opposition team perhaps was a little bit confused about what our team line was, because we were actually the team that maximized choice because we provided a countervailing norm to the pervasive norms in society that restricted women's choice. Those were the norms that they gave you in their very own analysis, which is why women currently feel like it's too hard and it's not worth it. Look, the counter norm to sexual assault that the feminist movement proposes is not to dress more conservatively. It's to say that it's okay to say no. That's the sort of thing that we support, literally empowering women to say no to men, to subvert those norms that men are used to, because that's something that they want to do. Insofar as you've accepted that characterization, we think most of the material that they've brought us falls out of the debate and we win at this point. 4 things that I'm going to talk about in this speech. Firstly, about principles and aims of the feminist movement. Secondly, about safety. Thirdly, about how it helps individual women. And finally, about how it helps the movement as a whole. Firstly, because it's an active debate, let's look at what the aims of the feminist movement are. We told you it was to maximize autonomy from these women and also to just generally provide a blanket of social support for women who want to subvert norms in society. They tacitly accepted this, but also brought this like principle that women shouldn't be accountable to the actions of men. Look, we've said 5 things in this debate to response to that. The first is to say, if the feminist movement doesn't do anything, men won't change at all, and the revealed preference of the feminist movement is to prioritize pragmatism. Secondly, the role of the feminist movement itself is to provide support for women so that they can resist those norms if they want to. That's something that the negative team never provides any counter mechanism for. Thirdly, even at the worst case, this is an active debate, right? So it's probably more important what the feminist movement cares about what's better for all women than perhaps the impact on an individual woman. But the fourth thing to say is this is generally a low stakes thing, right? Like, it's not like holding the door open for people, I'll talk about this later, is likely to lead to like an assault in most cases. I think that's a very like small proportion of cases they've chosen to focus on here. The final thing to say here is that the feminist movement just does take it on itself to change men's behavior, because that is literally one of the only ways that you're going to get change, because it's generally supported that most women in society tend to support like women's rights, right? Okay, secondly, let's talk about safety, because this was their key push at first, that they deprioritized it second. That was because it was never going to win them to this debate. They said that confrontation and uncertainty is bad for women. 6 responses. Firstly, we think we can carve the most dangerous times out of this debate, right? If you're literally at risk of being assaulted or murdered, it's unlikely that you're going to choose that time to listen to the feminist norm and like decide to like say no in that case. You're probably like going to prioritize your own safety in that case. Secondly, it's worse on their side of the house if women do want to reject things, because now there isn't a social environment that supports them to do so. And that way the negative team is a team that rejects the choice and autonomy of those women. Thirdly, we told you there's polite ways to do so that won't make men angry. No response. Fourth, we told you it's a low stakes place, but also it's a public place, right? So you're unlikely to get assaulted for like not letting them hold the door open for you, because there's probably also like 20 other people at that bar who can call that man out for it. The fifth thing to say is that norms aren't so strong or coercive, especially when they're coming from the disparate feminist movement, that a woman will listen to that norms when she feels unsafe. She'll only act in that way when she feels like she's justified to do so based on her personal beliefs, and weigh them up against the support she gains from the norms as well. The final thing we told you at second here that they didn't respond to is that we prioritize long-term change, right? So if we can prove in the long term that the actions of men change, that creates a safer society for more women in the future. So even if you do want to buy that this debate rests on safety, we're the side that actually gets more of that for more women in a greatest period of time. Okay, let's talk about how this helps individual women. Notice firstly the number of mechanisms we give you at first and second that never get any response from the other team. Firstly, on why this is particularly good for women, because they can be literally more independent to do what they want to do, because the feminist movement is going to provide social support for women who might have been marginalized from the feminist movement in other instances. And the third thing is, note that they never contested out like 4 reasons at Eugene why it would be done in a positive way, why the feminist movement is likely to do this messaging in a tolerant way, in an intersectional way, and in a universally applicable way. That means the messages aren't going to be so coercive and bad that women are going to do things that they don't want to do. They're going to be messages that women feel supported doing if they want to, but in the instance where they don't want to, they don't necessarily have to do that. We also tell you a number of reasons why it changes the behavior of men, right? We tell you that men are confronted, and not in the violent way that they want to talk about, but in a thought-provoking way, right? Like if you're holding a door open for a woman and she says, no, actually, I'd like to go in myself, please. You think, why did she say that? I thought I was doing a nice thing. And then you go on to think, well, maybe that's not what she wants. Maybe actually women have their own autonomy to think of what they want. And as a man, that's probably something that's particularly like you wouldn't ever happen on their side of the house. The second thing is we told you it gives more freedom for allies to actually present themselves in a way that supports the feminist movement, rather than like resorting to the basic, like opening a door open, oh, good job done, don't have to support women anymore. What do they say? They give you a number of like vague reasons as to why men's behavior will never change without actually substantiating them. 3 responses to those. The first is to say when more and more women listen to these norms on our side of the house, we're more likely to get men to change their behavior, because suddenly it's not just one woman who does it and you go on to the other woman at the bar. Like literally more people are doing that, so you can't avoid it. The second thing is their own analysis is that large sets of men are just becoming more woke in society. That's probably a good thing, because those men are likely to listen. And the final thing is to just say that that raises the burden on their side. Okay, why is this point important? Because these norms influence other norms. That was material we gave you at first. That even if there is a harm from women doing this, we think it's outweighed by the fact that if men are forced to confront the fact that perhaps chivalry isn't good enough, they're actually going to stop thinking of women as different. They're actually going to think we should be treating them the same way. Second thing we told you is a number of reasons why chivalry just directly equates with misogyny that they never gave any response to. The final thing to note here, and this is vital, is they provide no alternative. You only get men to stop catcalling by calling men out on catcalling. Likewise, you only get men to stop being misogynist by actually confronting them at the core. Insofar as we heard no counter mechanism from their side of the house, we're the side that wins that. Finally, let's talk about the feminist movement. They had three main pushes. The first was this will be seen as preachy. Two responses. Firstly, equally, if you don't do this, some women will feel left behind and be left out of the feminist movement. Secondly, the feminist movement is preachy all the time, right? And women often want to listen to that. They want to feel like there's a strong narrative that they can get behind. The second response from them is that media criticizes it as extreme. Firstly, right-wing media will probably always criticize the feminist movement. And secondly, left-wing media will probably herald it as something that's like revolutionary on Vox or whatever. The third thing is that women probably don't listen to that criticism personally. They don't think, oh, the media's criticizing me. It's just the movement that's being criticized. But fourthly, that just what we told you was that all discourse creates discussions. So insofar as you're actually creating discussions about this, that's an article spent on the feminist movement that wasn't otherwise spent on some other movement or some random piece of news that wasn't so important for the feminist movement, which note is the actor in this debate. So that's probably just a good thing inherently for that movement. It was unclear from them why that discourse would ever be harmful. The final thing they give you at second is that this only affects white women. That is a cookie cutter argument that they never really explain how it holds up in this debate. But more importantly, it probably this stuff happens to all women, particularly women of Asian descent, who are probably seen as like exotic, and that's something that you like can hold open the door for them to do that, right? At this point in the debate, we're probably the team that helps diverse intersectional women the best. Weigh that versus our material, right? Where we tell you that men can't subvert this to hurt other feminist movement policies by saying, well, maybe women want equal rights, but they still want us to buy them a drink. But also because you just create more discourse to subvert the norms. We galvanize a stale movement. We actually get support for that movement. That's probably what the feminist movement wants. But beyond that, we also just provide individual women the autonomy to do what they want to do in society and the actual ability to resist men who are doing things that they don't necessarily want them to do for them. So proud to propose.
The narratives that the feminist movement are going to disseminate in both worlds are probably like that women can do whatever the fuck they want. The feminist movement will always support them and their choices. It probably still looks like the fact that the feminist movement believes survivors, it believes those that are resisting sexual assault, and it's always saying that women ought to be able to protest against their treatment by men. I think it's also probably going to be things like, oh, that women owe nothing to men. That doesn't matter if you even bought her a drink or not, that she owes no obligation to you. So I think all of their red herrings about how they say we're taking away the ability for women to protest against sexual assault or whatever is bullshit and red herrings. Please don't credit any of them. So with that clarified, two questions in this speech. Firstly, on the principal clash, and secondly, on changing behavior. Firstly, on the principal clash. The first thing I just want you to intuitively think about is to consider the narrative that would be put out if the feminist movement said it is okay for you to dress less provocatively if you want. I think the key analysis that we tell you is that language is impossible to be entirely neutral, because at the point at which the feminist movement puts out a statement that is a priori seen as encouraging a certain behavior, and this is literally phrased in the way the motion is set. That is to say, people who would not otherwise do this behavior are now engaging in this. The second thing that we want to point out is to say that there's a difference between saying something is right versus saying something is not wrong. The feminist movement, as I already flagged in my introduction, is probably always going to say that you are capable of doing whatever you want, that it is not a wrong decision, they support your decision, which means that all their stuff about how women feel really shut out because they can't access the desire to take this thing in is probably really unlikely, because the overwhelming and dominant narrative of the feminist movement is just to support your choices. So that is to say, most women probably feel supported in whatever choices they make and don't feel locked out just because the feminist movement hasn't explicitly said, and we also support this kind of thing. I think the impact of this is that very few women are probably the ones that are currently locked out and are able to access some particular action in their world. But we tell you that far, far more people are likely to be coerced. Note in particular, even if you don't buy any of that and my analysis, know that their case is, the benefits of their case are contingent on people changing their behavior. That is to say, lots of people are now going to are currently locked out, because only then would society change and men learn, because women correct them. We tell you that you ought to weigh this less importantly than the principal obligation of coercing lots of women to doing this choice. Why do we tell you that it's likely to be exceedingly coercive? Just literally for the framing that because women are likely to believe in the feminist movement, believe that their dictates and norms are good, and particularly be obliged because they think that those are the actions that they ought to do to protect future women. So there's some kind of like, because I owe things to future women, I should do the things the feminist movement encourages me to do, which means that it's likely to change lots of women's behavior, even if it is not the case that they actively want to tell men to fuck off if they open the door for them. The reason why you ought weigh this thing most importantly is a couple of reasons. I think the intuition pump, the intuition pump, the simple mechanisms we gave you is that likely the women who are currently unable to access being able to telling men to fuck off are small in number and already extremely privileged. We told you this is probably because only predominantly white women are really in tap and so woke that they feel this is so outraged about these actions. App tells us no, but this affects all women. That is, say, all women have doors open for them. Yes, but there's an asymmetry in the responses of women, which is likely grounded in how the environment of the women. We tell you that most women, especially those that are overworked, that are those that are struggling to provide for their family, those who particularly feel unsafe because they are Black women or etc., are likely to just shrug it off, being like, oh, that's a man being kind of annoying, conservative, and dicky, as opposed to just being so moralizing outraged that we tell you is likely only to be a minority of privileged white women. This is why you ought weigh the principle of the onerousness first. The second thing is, I think the reason why you ought prioritize the lack of obligations onto other women is the intuition pump. That is to say, equity does not ask you to file a sexual harassment complaint if you do not want to. The feminist movement does not force you to go to police to report your domestic violence if you do not want to. And the reason is, it is the priorities of the feminist movement are not, as they say, to maximize choice or whatever. The first priorities of the feminist movement are likely to protect women, and particularly to protect women that have been harmed by men. And the reason why this is the case, more so than increasing net options or whatever, is firstly, increasing net options is such a vague benefit. But secondly, it's such a distinct betrayal of the feminist movement, which is the organization that is supposed to be to protect you. So I think that therefore it's so much more of a huge betrayal the feminist movement perceives if they contribute to the suffering of even more women. That is why the increased benefit of freedoms does not matter to the feminist movement, comparatively speaking. The second issue I want to talk about is changing behavior, right? And I think this links to our safety argument. So here are the reasons why behaviors won't change. I think they have lots of mechanisms. I'm going to outweigh all of those mechanisms by saying that the probability that those mechanisms actualize is contingent on the context and willingness of men's responses. That is to say, yes, maybe men become more woke and are more able to be distinguished as allies or whatever, but that is contingent on men having a good response and being willing to listen. And we importantly tell you that it's extremely unlikely that men are going to have such a pivotal part of their life, one that influences their self-identity and the literal power dynamics of their power dynamics within society, just at a random bar, at an interaction that they thought was nothing, that they don't think means anything, and then a woman is suddenly so angry and she'll in their face, right? They say, yes, but some men are woke and would listen, but then there's no marginal benefit, right? Because these men would educate themselves anyway, are listening to the feminist movement, are listening to the types of narratives the feminist movement is disseminating, which means that I think you ought to prioritize our mechanisms about the response of men. And the reason is because we tell you the depth of the effects of men is extremely important. That is to say, self-identity and power dynamics are probably very core parts of your identity. It is, even if you desire to be woke or whatever, is more likely to influence your gut wrench reaction, which is the reaction you're more likely to default to at the point at which this interaction was unexpected, which means that the likely reaction of men to this is not to be really nuanced and really listen to women when they explain to them the cultural dynamics, but just to have that gut wrench reaction, tell women to fuck off and get really, really aggressive, We tell you this is fucking terrible because this jeopardizes the women, even if it doesn't lead to sexual assault. Men are far more likely to be very aggressive to make women feel unsafe. Their response to this is to say, but it's in public, men can correct other men's behavior. No guarantee that those other men are woke. What if you live in a conservative town where every single man is likely to hate that feminist because she corrected a man? I think it gets worse in their world because it is in public, because all men are able to be shit and shit on that poor feminist. So happy to negate.